They told us Europe's rise was about exploration, bravery, destiny. It wasn't. It was about credit. Behind every cannon fired, every ship launched, every empire claimed, there was a lender. One family wealthy enough to bankroll nations. They didn't rule armies. They ruled the people who commanded armies, and their influence stretched from royal courts to battlefields to the foundations of the modern financial system. Welcome to Money Moves, where money, power, and history collide, and where nothing is ever as simple as the textbooks make it seem. Because before Europe carved its empires across continents, one banking dynasty had already carved its influence across Europe, financing conquests, underwriting monarchs, and turning geopolitics into a balance sheet. In the early Renaissance, kings pretended to rule by divine right, but their power depended on something far less holy: liquidity. War was expensive. Exploration was expensive, maintaining armies, building fleets, bribing nobles, paying diplomats. None of it worked without capital. Monarchs didn't they? Avenuk. Taxes came slow. Gold was scarce. Land was valuable, but illiquid. Borrowing became a necessity. And that necessity created opportunity. Into this world stepped a family whose name would reshape Europe. They began as textile merchants in Augsburg, far from the palaces of Europe. But they mastered a crucial lesson. Power doesn't come from gold itself. It comes from controlling who gets to use it as their fortunes grew. Kings came calling. What started as trade became banking. What began as loans to nobles became the financial lifeline of empires. By the late 1400s, the Fuggers financed everything from mining operations to military campaigns. They weren't just bankers. They were kingmakers. They held monopolies on copper and silver, controlled mining rights across Central Europe, and built a financial network that stretched from Lisbon to When monarchs needed money, the Fuggers didn't just lend. They negotiated. They demanded privileges, trade rights, tax exemptions, political leverage, and in return they fueled the ambitions of Europe's most powerful rulers. The moment that made them indispensable came in 1519. The Holy Roman throne was up for election. 3 men wanted the crown: the King of France, the King of England, and a young Habsburg named Charles. The electors weren't looking for virtue, they were looking for payment. The bidding war was brutal, and only one side had the backing of Europe's most aggressive bankers. Jacob Fugger wrote to Charles with a simple message: "I will finance your victory." And he did. Bribes were distributed. Votes were secured. Charles won, and Europe learned a new truth. Emperors were no longer chosen by God. They were financed by bankers. But power like this came with a cost. The Fuggers didn't just support Charles V for prestige. They expected returns. In exchange, they received imperial monopolies, mining concessions, and the right to tax entire regions. They became the unofficial treasury of the Habsburg Empire, covering deficits, funding wars against France and the Ottoman Empire, and financing Spain's expansion across the Atlantic. When Spanish ships brought home mountains of silver from the New World, the first people paid weren't soldiers, they were the bankers. This wasn't philanthropy. It was a business model. Every war fueled demand for loans. Every conquest required supplies. Every crisis strengthened the banker's role. The Fuggers turned turbulence into income. They built a system where empires rose on credit, and where those empires became dependent on their feet. But their influence didn't stop at borders. They reshaped economics itself. Their ledgers introduced new accounting standards. Their letters coded financial intelligence. Their branch networks operated like early multinational corporations. And their loans introduced the idea that national debt could be leveraged to expand state power. While kings claimed glory, the Fuggers audited reality. Yet, no empire, not even a banking empire, is invincible. As Europe expanded, as trade exploded, as new powers rose, the financial map shifted. The Atlantic world was emerging new merchant families. The Welsors, the Medici, the Dutch patricians challenged the old order. Spain's debts ballooned, wars dragged on, and the Fuggers faced a dangerous problem: They had tied their wealth to the fate of indebted monarchs. When Spain defaulted, the shock rippled through Europe. Fortunes evaporated. Markets collapsed. For the first time, the world saw what happens when governments fail to pay their bills. Panic, inflation, and the collapse of trust. The modern debt crisis was born. The Fuggers survived barely, but their dominance faded, and in their place rose a new kind of financial power. Joint stock companies, central banks, and global trading corporations, capable of moving more wealth than any dynasty could. But here, as the pot history forgets, Europe as age of empires was never driven by bravery or destiny. It was driven by access to capital. The Portuguese voyages to India, the Spanish conquest of the Americas, the Habsburg Wars, the rise of the English Navy, none would have been possible without private bankers underwriting the risks. One family didn't just finance Europe's history, they engineered it. They taught states to borrow. They taught rulers to spend future income today. They taught Europe that money could build empires faster than swords. And they created the blueprint for the modern financial world, one where nations run on credit. Markets run on trust, and the real power belongs not to those on thrones, but to those who control the flow of capital. 500 years later, the lesson hasn't changed. Behind every global project, every national budget, every military escalation, every crisis and recovery, there's always a lender. Governments still borrow. Markets still react, nations still rise and fall based on access to credit. And somewhere, always, there is a banker writing the terms. Because history repeats, but the balance sheets stay the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. Money Moves brings you the stories behind the systems and the power behind the stories.